Hi, I'm Lisa Hernandez.
And I'm Lizzie Getty-Ehrlich.
And we are your hosts for Scholar Strategy Network's No Jargon. Each month, we will discuss an American policy problem with one of the nation's top researchers without jargon. And this month, we are looking at the student debt crises in our nation.
Well, we both work at a policy nonprofit, so, we have some student debt.
Oh, absolutely. And, I have been having a lot of fun not being forced to pay it for the last 2 years. So this hits close to home, and close to my own pockets, unfortunately. But
true enough.
Yes. So it was a really engaging conversation that I had with our guest. And honestly, it really validates a lot of the concerns of just growing wealth after student debt and all of that, all the issues that comes with carrying such a great amount of debt that so many Americans are carrying. So that was really interesting and startling. And also, oh my goodness, we cannot ignore this issue or keep pushing it off. It's something that needs to be addressed as soon as possible.
I mean, as a person who has my own student debt, and as a person who we recently paid off my husband's student debt because he did not have federal loans, private loans, not paused. So also understand that there's people with debt out there that haven't even felt the effects of the pandemic student loan pause policies. But it's interesting to me because for folks like us who have friends like we have, like the people that we know all have this debt and it feels so ubiquitous and it feels like a crisis. And then there's a lot of people out there who don't, or who say like, no, like you all are some small specific segment of, people in America don't treat this like it's everyone's problem. And then we have scholars like who you're going to talk to today who say, well, we want to take the problem for what it is and actually examine the people who are in it. And we, even though there's a bunch of us with student loans, we do not all feel the repercussions of that debt equally. And that matters too. So there's like a lot of different ways you can kind of think about this particular problem.
Right. I mean, everyone knows someone who is carrying some form of student debt. I feel, at least in the US, most people do. And it's something that is affecting families overall. But I mean, I guess we'll see what happens. Every month, it's kind of like a we'll see what happens type of game that we're playing of, maybe next month we'll know if 10K will be taken off or 50 or whatever numbers are being thrown out.
We never do this on No Jargon, or the scholars we speak to typically don't, even though we sometimes try to invite them to. But I'm going to make a prediction. This is me as a follower of politics. So as of today, we're getting into the last week of May. There has still been no definitive action. Student loans keep being paused, but all this talk about potentially, wiping all or some portion of debt, that still has not happened. But every day we inch closer to some form of resolution. I think they're going to do it. And I think they're going to do it up to a cap, like that 10 grand that they said. And that's my prediction. We'll have to meet back here and see what happens.
Well, let's place a lot of bets here because my bet is we're going to keep pushing it off. So we'll see what happens, especially after this episode airs. Maybe we'll have a clearer idea of what's going to happen, Lizzie. So for this week's episode, I spoke to Fenaba Addo. Fenaba Addo is an associate professor of public policy at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her recent work examines debt and wealth inequality with a focus on family and relationships and higher education. Here's our conversation. Hi, Professor Addo. Thanks for coming on No Jargon.
Hello, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon.
Fantastic. So we are talking today about student debt, which has, of course, been a major topic of discussion, especially the last 2 years. And as people who live in the U.S., we are pretty familiar with debt, but we hear the specific phrase of student debt crisis a lot. So let's start a conversation by having you really break down the crisis aspect of it. Can you explain why we are in crisis mode and what makes this a crisis?
Sure. So yes, and I'll say like the term crisis is actually quite controversial amongst scholars and policy folks. So not everybody likes to use the term to describe what is going on, right? what's been going on with student debt, the number of people who are having to take on loans in order to finance our higher education, that number has grown just like in pure like population-wide numbers of people that are going to higher education and having to pay for their education. And then the price of higher education has increased over time. And so we see more and more graduates and people who unfortunately, do not complete their degrees, leaving school with significant amounts of debt. But the crisis that I think most people are more familiar with is what happens after, which is struggling to repay those loans. So the amount of debt that they are carrying as they move further and further away from higher education. And I think it's really important, and we'll hopefully, we'll get into this a bit more when we're talking about this, of who exactly are we talking about who's in crisis with regard to the student debt crisis. So there is, like I said, some controversy around the word because on paper or, a lot of stats will show that many people who took on loans to go to college and are in repayment are fine. They're not struggling, especially if you're able to secure a job that pays a decent, and a livable salary will pay those debts off over time. But then there is a growing contingent of people who have struggled and are continuing to struggle and are not seeing those debt balances decrease over time. And that's really who we're talking about when we think about the crisis.
So we can talk a little bit more about the who here. So who is mostly affected by this crisis, for lack of a better term right now, whether it's controversial or not? Who are the people that are mostly affected by student debt at the moment?
Okay, so the people who are most affected, I would say, or that have received probably the bulk of the attention are people who are in default or delinquency. And these actually tend to be borrowers who have relatively lower balances, so like less than 20K in outstanding debt, but they also tend to be concentrated among people who have not completed their degrees, or the non-completers. A lot of people who have some college, a couple of college credits, and then have not been able to complete, finish or get their 4-year degree. However, the work that I've done and with many of my colleagues have also revealed, along with work from other scholars such as Scott Clayton, for example, that Black borrowers in particular fall into this category of borrowers who are also in crisis, independent of whether or not they completed their degree, independent of where they attended, like the types of institutions that they've attended. And so Black borrowers are overwhelmingly represented in the crisis category, meaning that they accumulate large amounts of debt and they're struggling with repayment and are more likely to have high rates of default and delinquency.
So let's talk about default specifically. Could you tell us a little bit about what defaulting on debt is, especially like education debt, and how it can affect a person's life?
Yeah, defaulting means that the borrower has been unable to pay any money towards their outstanding loan balance. And it's usually gauged at around 270 days. So for at least 270 days, they have not been able to make a payment of at least $1 on their loan, their outstanding loan amount. And so, this usually gets flagged by the credit agencies, goes on your credit report, and in the short term can have real consequences for the ability to borrow, and if you have the ability to borrow, or if you're trying to purchase a vehicle, or even maybe a larger purchase like a house, and are able to secure a loan, you're probably paying much more on that. It's going to be much more expensive to borrow, right? Because you're going to be pushed into a population of people for whom it's going to be, higher interest rates and so on and so forth. So in the long run, you're going to be paying more for that default on your record. There's also, other unfortunate consequences such as wage garnishment. We hear about employers, using credit reports for hiring purposes, right? So if you have some indication on your credit report that you are, in default, or you have some negative signal on your credit report, it can really, influence your career trajectories as well, or your ability to earn an income.
Absolutely, it can. And I want to mention, because I sort of referenced a report of yours, but I haven't really mentioned the full title here. So you talk about all of this in your report that was published in May of last year, called Ensuring a More Equitable Future, exploring and measuring the relationship between family wealth, education debt, and wealth accumulation. In that report, you focus a lot on how wealth has a lot to do with how much someone's life will be affected by student debt, right? And it sounds like your research has uncovered that family wealth plays a particularly big role. How is family wealth measured when gathering this sort of data on its impact?
Yeah, so family wealth, basic definition of wealth that we use is actually a shortened form of the term net worth, which
Mm-hmm.
is the difference between the total values of one's financial and non-financial assets minus their liabilities or their debts. So when we talk about wealth, that's what we're thinking about. It's like the stock of money
Yeah.
that individuals have on their household balance sheets that they can tap into and use for obviously to purchase things, but also as a private safety net that confers lots of things that I want to be clear about this. It's a mechanism for providing access to essentially what we like to think of as power and choice and decision making that those who lack wealth
Mm-hmm.
are not necessarily get access to, and therefore fall into categories which expose you to a lot more risk and in particular financial risk. So when we're thinking about, like in this case, family wealth, a significant amount of American families have their wealth in their homes, and in particular, during the 90s and 2000s, we saw a lot of increases in home equity. So people became wealthier in their homes, for example. And it was also, disproportionate in our society of who was able to, who are homeowners and who are more likely to, were able to gain from that economic boom, and how they're able to use that money in order to not only secure access to power, capital, all those things, but also help their family and their children out. And so there's a lot of great research, which I cite in the article, the report that you are referencing, around evidence that children whose parents experience like growth in their home equity were able to go to college, choose more expensive colleges, and more likely to complete college, for example. When we look at the wealth gap, a lot of the work that I do actually centers on racial wealth inequality and how differences in like the typical holdings of Black households versus white households actually kind of constrains the ability to make these choices and to make these transitions, especially among young adults. And the focus has been on the role that it's played in interacting with higher education and the ability to pay for college.
You mentioned those who don't get a degree. So what happens to the debt of those who borrow money in order to get a degree but don't necessarily complete it? Since their debt is likely less than their counterparts, is it easier to pay off? Is it more risky to pay off in the long term?
I would say, that the evidence suggests that they are struggling to pay. If you don't complete your studies, if you don't complete your degree, you can have a higher risk of struggling in the labor market, finding jobs that are a little bit more stable, have come with job security and with benefits, and just maybe don't pay enough for you to, even if the debt balance is small, it maybe your debt burden is very high, meaning your debt burden, which is the debt to income, or sometimes people look at debt to assets ratios. And so you may not have, at the end of the month, after paying for all your necessities, including, housing, utilities, and so on, enough to pay down that debt or even make a minimum payment on that debt.
So we have established that student debt has serious consequences on many people's lives, especially Black folks and people of color. So I want to talk a little bit about solutions. There's been a lot of talk about solutions to remedy the crises. And lately, the U.S. Department of Education talked about their public service loan forgiveness program and a plan to retroactively help millions of federal student loan borrowers who are in large debt from their repayment plans. So can you talk about, based on your research, what your suggestions for the U.S. Department of Education or just policymakers who want to take action on the student loan debt crises?
Sure. So I think what we've been seeing, especially by the Biden administration and the Department of Education, is attempts to fix kind of issues with the repayment systems in place. One of the probably most public programs that what you referenced in your question is the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which kind of guarantees some debt forgiveness after working for an employer that qualifies under this program for a given amount of time, usually about 10 years. And one example why it's been a little bit problematic is that people weren't, well, it hasn't been clear, and I'll attribute this to something that we kind of call administrative burden around what types of loans qualified for people to be eligible for PSLF. And so there's been a lot of focus because I think that, from early reports on people who should have been able to get their debt either canceled after the 10 years of service, finding out that the types of loans that they had weren't actually part of the program. And so attempts by the Department of Ed to kind of fix that and allow or kind of like grandfather in some loans that were not necessarily included in the program, and so that these people who thought that they were eligible could become eligible for the program. So that being said, that was just a quick briefer of kind of what's been going on about a lot of confusion and miscommunication among servicers and borrowers around how to use and work these programs in a way to help them absolve themselves from this debt. And so getting back to like efforts to kind of fix these kind of issues within the program have focused on clarifying and increasing, I would say, the chances that more people would qualify and sign up for these types of programs. Now, this particular program, I should say, is specific. Like I said, it's dependent on your employer and the types of work that the employer does. It's not going to capture, the universe of all borrowers because not everyone goes to work for employers that qualify for this program. So what does that mean? A lot of people are paying on their debts, and working for other employers or other different circumstances and are still also, struggling to repay. And how are they going to be, reached, or how are they going to be helped if they're struggling with repayment? So I think we really need to see some efforts beyond just the programs that are created by, the government to help with repayment and are tied to public service to address the other populations of borrowers with outstanding debt who are really struggling. There are several, I think, like 5 or 6 different types of income repayment plans that a lot of people have been focusing on to kind of not only figure out why people are struggling within these particular payment plans to repay if they're supposed to be assisting them, but also kind of streamlining the number of plans that are out there and reducing the burden on the borrower to actually, to navigate these systems. So I think what we've seen a lot of the efforts of the administration are focused on. But then there's also the broader conversation of the larger student debt cancellation question as well. So are we going to also see efforts by this administration and the Department of Education to address the broader desire and need call from many to just remove the debt?
Based on your research, what do you propose that our government should do in order to fully assist those who are experiencing these burdens? Do you propose canceling student debt overall? Is this something that the Biden administration should consider taking seriously? I know they have been kind of going back and forth on how much student debt should be canceled. Should it be all of it? How? And should it just be public loans or private loans? And there's so many questions. But do you propose that canceling student debt, fully canceling it, is the best way to go about handling this crisis?
So the big, $1 million question.
Yeah, big question.
I am in support of debt cancellation, and I'll tell you why. From the lens, that I have studied this topic, it has been one of both economic inequality and racial justice. And the research that I've done has focused primarily on the struggle of, in particular, Black students and their families who have had to take on this debt and then carry and struggle in repayment with this debt. So I really have examined and explored, along with my co-authors, how the systems and structures within the higher ed financing space have not necessarily served to provide the supports these borrowers and their families have needed in order to get rid of this debt, right? And a lot of it is due to policies in place, not necessarily individual decision making on the part of people. And so I think a policy-based solution is what is needed and would be the right solution to this particular problem to address, it through that lens. And so that is where I fall on this question. And so, yes, I am in support. Now, getting into the amount, the number, the level, I do think it's, if we're going to look at it through this, kind of racial justice, inequality, economic inequality lens, Black borrowers take on a lot more debt, just due to existing wealth inequalities. And that means that they have a lot more debt to absolve. So if you just cancel a little bit, it could provide a little bit of relief. But if you really want to try to make a transformative or difference in the lives of these households, then we're going to have to go a little bit higher than 10.
So what would you say to critics of canceling student loan debt to make clear why student cancellation is the best way to move forward?
I would say that I think it would be a strong signal and a strong indication by our policy system, by policymakers, and an acknowledgement that the system has not been working in a way to help students and families financially. And I think that I think that it would also be an indication that the government is listening to the constituents and their arguments around how much the debt and debt accumulation has really impacted and influenced their lives. I think we've said, over the past few years, this has just become quite a public issue, and it's reflective of how many people are touched by student debt, not necessarily just the students who are enrolled, but their families as well. And doing nothing is not a policy solution at this point anymore. I think if we really want to kind of address growing economic inequality within our society, this is an important policy topic that should continue to be centered within these discussions, especially since we know that higher education tends to be remains one of the strongest predictors of long-term financial stability and security, like the ability to secure a well-paying job within our society. So if we're going to still kind of support the role of higher education within the broader society and community, then we need to be finding ways to signal to individuals that if you go down that path, we will be supportive of those efforts and not try to create additional barriers to realizing those goals. And so far, especially within the most recent generations of young adults and their families, this financial risk that they've had to take on has been a real barrier to kind of realizing those long-term goals of higher education.
Absolutely. I think you really encapsulated well how just this one policy change, this one, focusing on this one debt issue could really affect so many families and could really affect wealth disparities overall. So thank you for sharing those thoughts with me. And I want to ask you for any final thoughts that you have that you think our listeners should take back with them as they're having their own discussions about student loan debt crises.
Yeah, I think that, this is an effort, especially if you are in support of debt cancellation, in which it will be really important to continue to put pressure on our policymakers, our representatives or our elected representatives. And if we really want to see changes happening, I think we've gotten this far due to the pressure. And not allowing people to kind of sidetrack or sideline this issue. And I think it will only continue to be prioritized by movements of younger generations, social movement groups to kind of make this happen. So I've been thoroughly and amazingly impressed by, the reach of people who are working in this space beyond just academics and policymakers. And I think that is needed in order to continue to, drive home how important this topic is and how important and necessary, real substantive change is needed for, to achieve the outcomes that we all want and would like to see by our government.
And I appreciate you being a part of that community of folks, of just using your power, your voice, and trying to voice why student loan debt affects so many people and how it does so. So thank you for coming on No Jargon. It was a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thanks. It was a pleasure to speak with you as well.
And thanks for listening. For more on Professor Addo's work, check out our show notes at scholars.org/nojargon. No Jargon is the podcast of the Scholar Strategy Network, a nationwide organization that connects journalists, policymakers, and civic leaders with America's top researchers to improve policy and strengthen democracy. The producer of our show is Mandana Mosen-Sadagon, and if you like the show, please subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your shows. You can give us feedback on Twitter at No Jargon Podcast or at our email address, nojargon@scholars.org.